She refused the Duke of Fernworth at 21 because a jealous suitor told her the courtship was a calculated move. She believed him. For 4 years, she built her life around that certainty. Then his sister invited them both to the same country house party and handed her 6 letters he had asked to be burned. Letters that proved he had never stopped wanting her. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, which Lady Charlotte Vane would later consider appropriate. Mondays were for resolve, Tuesdays for carrying it out, Wednesdays were for the quiet ambush, the letter that arrived between the marmalade and the Morning Post, wearing the face of an ordinary thing. It looked ordinary enough. Louisa Hale, Louisa Crawley now having married Mr. Robert Crawley of Denmore Park at Easter, wrote in her usual hand, warm and slightly uneven, the loops of her letters too generous for the line. She invited Charlotte to a fortnight's house party at Denmore, beginning the 14th of October. There would be walks, she promised, and good fires and a cook borrowed from her mother's house who did remarkable things with game pie. She mentioned 7 other guests by way of atmosphere. She did not, in 4 pages of characteristic warmth and detail, mention her brother. Charlotte read the letter to the end, set it down, looked out the window of Vane Court's breakfast room at the Wiltshire morning, which was doing nothing dramatic, just the usual copper and pale gold of October coming on, the elm trees at the edge of the park beginning to let go. She had not seen William Hale, Duke of Fernworth, in 4 years. She picked up the letter and read it again, more slowly. The way one reads documents one is looking for something in. Louisa had not mentioned him. This was itself a kind of information. Charlotte set the letter beside her coffee cup, thought for the length of time it took a leaf to cross the lawn outside the window, and then called for paper and ink. She wrote back the same morning. I should be delighted. She sealed it before she could revise the decision, gave it to the footman, and returned to the novel she had been pretending to read since 7 o'clock. She did not, she told herself, dwell on it further. She dwelled on it for 3 weeks. The Vanes were not a family to be trifled with socially. Charlotte's father, the late Earl of Vane, had been one of those quiet northern peers whose name meant something beyond the acreage, a man of principle and considerable fortune whose clean reputation had outlasted 2 governments and several scandals in which he had refused pointedly to participate. Charlotte's brother Edward now held the earldom, and held it well, though he was only 28 and still occasionally gave the impression of a man surprised to find himself the head of something. Charlotte herself at 25 was the kind of young woman that the Tun discussed in terms of it being a pity she had not yet married, while simultaneously being slightly uncertain what to do with her in a room. She was too intelligent to be decorative, too well connected to be dismissed, and too uninterested in performance to make the usual moves. She had been once, briefly and precisely, the kind of young woman a certain duke had very much wanted to marry. The carriage from Vane Court to Denmore Park took the better part of 2 days. A first night broken at an inn outside Coventry, a second morning of Derbyshire roads that had strong opinions about the season, and Charlotte arrived on the afternoon of the 14th with the particular stiffness of someone who has spent too long in a well-appointed box and is grateful for solid ground. The sky was grey, the smell of rain coming, the copper beeches on Denmore's long drive catching what light there was and doing something extraordinary with it. Louisa met her at the door before the footman had finished with the steps. She had always been beautiful, fine-boned and dark-haired, with her brother's quality of attention softened by warmth, and she was beautiful still, though something had settled in her since the spring. Marriage suited her. It was visible in the way she stood in her own doorway, in the ease with which she commanded the household behind her, without appearing to think about it. Charlotte embraced her, and felt, briefly and without pride, a small uncomplicated gladness for her friend, and beneath it, the particular wistfulness of someone watching another person arrive somewhere they have not yet reached. "So you came?" Louisa said, which was what she always said when she was genuinely surprised. "You asked," Charlotte said. "I have been asking you to visit me every season since I married. You have found a reason each time." Louisa tilted her head. "This year you did not." "This year you mentioned the game pie." Louisa laughed. "The real one, not the drawing-room version. Come in, the fire is lit and everyone is assembled, and I want to hear about Edward's disastrous attempt at estate management before dinner." It was not disastrous. The Northfield merely... "Come in and tell me." Charlotte followed her into the entrance hall, which smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the particular warmth of a well-run house that has just received its guests. She handed her cloak to a waiting footman, smoothed the front of her travelling dress, and allowed herself precisely one breath of private steadying before Louisa pushed open the drawing-room door. 9 people looked up. Charlotte catalogued them the way one does, quickly, without appearing to. Beside Louisa stood Mr. Robert Crawley, her husband, a broad, open-faced man of perhaps 32, who shook Charlotte's hand with the genuine pleasure of someone who had wanted a full house all his life and had finally arranged one. To his left, 2 sisters from the neighbouring county, introduced as Miss Anne Pemberton and Miss Clara Pemberton, one sharp-eyed and quick, the other quieter but watchful. Beside them, a Major Holt, who wore his recent return from the continent in the set of his shoulders, and seemed grateful for the domesticity of a country house. A young married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Dean, barely 6 months wed, still in the delicate early stage of discovering each other's social habits. Near the fire, Mr. Crawley's elderly uncle, Sir Edmund, held court from the best armchair, speaking at length to the man standing beside him, which was, Charlotte registered in the space of a breath, William Hale. He had not yet turned. He was standing with his side to the room, attending to Sir Edmund, with the particular patience of a man who has learned that the elderly do not require responses so much as witnesses, and he had not heard the door. Sir Edmund's monologue reached a natural pause. William turned. His eyes found her across the room with the directness of a man who had known she was there the moment the door opened. Charlotte held his gaze for the 2 seconds required by courtesy, and offered the nod of acknowledgement, between 2 people of rank who have a shared history that neither is prepared to perform in company. His expression did not change. He inclined his head. Then he looked back at Sir Edmund. Louisa appeared at Charlotte's elbow with a glass of sherry, and a smile that was, Charlotte noted, approximately 4 degrees too bright to be uncontrived. "You did not tell me," Charlotte said very quietly, "that he would be here. I did not think you would come if I had." "That," Charlotte said, accepting the sherry, "was extremely well reasoned." "I thought so," Louisa agreed, and steered her toward the Pembertons with the practiced ease of a woman who had planned this moment for some time. Dinner that first evening was well managed and excellent, which helped considerably. Charlotte was placed between Major Holt and Mr. Crawley, which helped more. William sat at the far end of the table, between Anne Pemberton and Mrs. Dean, whose youth and prettiness he attended to with the correct degree of ducal courtesy. Charlotte observed this once from the corner of her eye and called it orientation, the noting of furniture. The conversation around her was easy enough. Major Holt had come back from the continent with views on everything and the gift of expressing them briefly. Mr. Crawley had views on his cook and his estate and his wife, all of which were enthusiastically held and easy to encourage. Charlotte laughed at the right moments, contributed to the conversation about the condition of northern roads, and ate her way through a dinner of several excellent courses, the last of which was the game pie, which was, as Louisa had promised, extraordinary. After dinner, the party reconvened in the drawing-room. Cards were proposed. Charlotte joined a hand of whist with Mr. Crawley, Anne Pemberton, and Major Holt, who played with military decisiveness and was surprisingly easy to read. Across the room, Mrs. Dean settled at the pianoforte with practiced fingers. Sir Edmund was asleep in his chair before the first hand was dealt. William did not play cards. He stood near the fire with a cup of coffee and spoke at intervals with Mr. Dean, who appeared pleased and slightly awed by the attention. Charlotte did not watch this. She attended to her hand, which was poor, and to Anne Pemberton, who played with a dry wit that Charlotte found immediately likable. "You are an old friend of Mrs. Crawley's?" Anne asked between tricks. "Since we were 17. We were at the same house in Bath for a season." "And the Duke, he is her brother?" "Yes." "He is very tuned," Anne considered, "contained." Charlotte arranged her cards. "He is." "Is that a diplomatic answer?" "It is an accurate one." Anne looked at her with the quick intelligence that Charlotte had already noted and approved. "I see," she said, and played her card, and did not pursue it further. At 10:30, Charlotte excused herself, said her good evenings, and went upstairs. Her room was in the east wing, generous, well-appointed, with a view of the back garden, and beneath the east-facing window, a window seat broad enough for a person and a book, and the better part of an October evening. Charlotte had noted it approvingly on arrival. She dismissed her maid, changed out of her dinner dress, and sat in the window seat in the dark, watching the rain that had arrived sometime during the fish course. The garden below was black and silver. The rain moved across it in slow, irregular waves. She was not thinking about William Hale. She was thinking in a practical and organized fashion about the 11 days remaining of the house party and about the geometry of managing them. Dinners could be navigated by placement. Mornings were individual enough to allow for avoidance. Afternoons in company required a certain careful distribution of attention, not conspicuous avoidance, which would be noted, but the kind of even sociability that left no particular gap. She had been doing this at a comfortable distance of 150 miles for 4 years. The challenge now was simply the distance. She went to bed. She slept adequately. In the morning, the rain had not stopped. The rain settled in with the particular stubbornness of Derbyshire autumn rain. Not a storm, but a decision. By the second morning, it was clear that it intended to make its point thoroughly before considering departure, and the house party adapted accordingly. The billiard room acquired a masculine population by mid-morning. The upstairs sitting room became the province of the Pemberton sisters and their respective projects. Anne writing letters with unusual speed, Clara pursuing an embroidery that appeared to be getting larger rather than smaller. Mrs. Dean practiced at the pianoforte with the diligence of a woman who had recently discovered she had more time than she was accustomed to. Major Holt catalogued Mr. Crawley's gun-room with military thoroughness. Sir Edmund slept in various chairs with democratic impartiality. Charlotte found the library on the morning of the second day. It occupied the south wing, which gave it 2 tall windows facing what would in better weather be the main garden. The room was long and lower ceilinged than the rest of the house, lined floor to ceiling on 3 walls, smelling of leather and the particular mustiness of books that are read rather than arranged for effect. Between the 2 south windows was a deep window seat, cushioned in faded green that had once been something brighter and was now precisely the right color, worn to comfort, not to shabbiness. A fire burned in the grate, set and lit by the housemaids before the household had come down. Charlotte settled into the window seat with Mrs. Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, a cup of tea that had been excellent when poured and was now adequately warm, and the private satisfaction of someone who has found the best room in a house. She had been there 20 minutes when the door opened. William came in without looking up. He was carrying a book. She caught the spine. Virgil's Aeneid. In the original, which was entirely characteristic, and he moved toward the far shelves with the unhurried purpose of a man who had been reading in this room since Louisa and Crawley married and knew exactly where to find what he wanted. He had not expected company. The set of his shoulders said so, though he gave no other indication. He found his place on the shelf, ran his finger along the spines, selected a second volume slimmer and turned. He saw her. The pause was brief and controlled. His face did nothing dramatic. "Lady Charlotte." "Your Grace." He looked at the window seat. He looked at the room, which contained several perfectly serviceable alternatives, 2 armchairs by the fire, a reading table near the door. He chose the armchair nearest the hearth, which was the farthest point from the window seat that courtesy permitted, without making the choice itself a statement. He sat, he opened his book. Charlotte returned to hers. The fire crackled. The rain pressed steadily at the glass. She turned a page. He turned a page. The clock on the mantelpiece struck the 1/4 hour. The room asked nothing of them. "You are reading Radcliffe," he said without looking up. "I am." "For the first time?" "The third." A pause. He turned a page. "You find it improves on repetition?" "I find most things do. The structure becomes clearer when one is no longer anxious about the outcome." He looked up at that, just briefly. "That presupposes the outcome was satisfying to begin with." "Satisfying enough," Charlotte said. "And one reads for different things the third time, not suspense, architecture." He considered this with the attention he brought to most things. Not polite attention, not the performance of listening, but the kind that implied the thought was actually being held and turned over. And what does the architecture reveal? That everything alarming was foreshadowed from the first page, Charlotte said. She hides nothing. One was simply too distracted by the surface to see it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he returned to his Virgil. Charlotte returned to her Radcliffe. The 1/4 hour became the half. The rain continued its patient argument with the windows. When William finally rose to leave, he gathered his books with the economy of motion that was simply how he moved through the world, and paused at the door. "Good morning, Lady Charlotte." "Good morning, Your Grace." He left. She sat with her book open in her lap and looked at the page. She had not read a word of it in the last 20 minutes. Louisa found her that afternoon, in the small upstairs sitting room that had been tacitly designated Charlotte's letter-writing station. "You are not writing letters," Louisa said, sitting opposite without being invited. "You are looking at the middle distance." "I am composing." "You have been composing for 40 minutes. It is either a very long letter or not a letter at all." She folded her hands. She had the expression Charlotte had known since they were 17, patient on purpose, prepared to wait. "He was in the library." "He was." "And?" Charlotte set down her pen. "We were civil." Louisa said nothing for a moment, then, "Lady Charlotte Vane, after 4 years civil." "Civil is an achievement given the history." "What is the history precisely?" Louisa's voice was gentle, which was the more effective version. "Because I have been sitting between the two of you for 4 years, and I have never understood it. You refused him. You have never told me why, and he has never told me why you did, and I have been constructing explanations in the absence of information and finding all of them insufficient." Charlotte looked at her. "He did not behave badly," Louisa pressed. "I would know. He is my brother, and he is, on the whole, incapable of behaving badly. He is simply incapable of explaining himself, which is a different problem entirely, and one I have had opinions about since childhood. So whatever it was not conduct. It was not—" "It doesn't matter now," Charlotte said. "It clearly does, or you would not look like that." "Like what?" Louisa regarded her with the steady affection of 4 years and said, "Like a woman who decided something and has been living with the decision ever since and is no longer entirely certain she decided correctly." Charlotte had no answer for that. She picked up her pen. Louisa, to her considerable credit, let the subject alone, though she did not leave, and her silence had the quality of patience held in reserve. Outside the window, the rain continued its business. The house party found its rhythm across the 3rd and 4th days. Mornings were individual. Afternoons drew the party into the drawing room for music, cards, conversation, that moved easily between the inconsequential and the genuinely interesting. Major Holt proved to have views on poetry as well as ordnance, which surprised everyone, including himself. Anne Pemberton was sharply funny on the subject of Bath, which Charlotte appreciated. Mr. Crawley's love for his estate was absolute, and slightly exhausting and entirely endearing. Charlotte and William Hale did not seek each other out. They were, however, with a frequency that Charlotte was finding increasingly difficult to attribute to coincidence, placed in proximity. On the 3rd afternoon, Louisa arranged the drawing-room seating for a musical recital with the casual authority of a natural tactician. Clara Pemberton played. She was genuinely accomplished, with a clean touch and good timing, and the chairs arranged themselves in a shallow curve. Charlotte found herself beside William with the naturalness of furniture that had always been there. He sat with his ankle crossed over his knee and appeared to listen. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to Clara, and was also, helplessly, aware of the space between them. 3 inches, perhaps 4, the warmth of a person in a cold room. Clara played a difficult passage cleanly, then stumbled on the following bar, and the stumble cost her the next 4 notes. She grimaced without stopping. Charlotte heard from her right a quiet sound, barely a sound at all, more an exhalation with a shape to it. She turned. William was looking at her, not at the piano, at her. She turned back to Clara, but she felt the colour at her throat. On the 4th morning she arrived at the library to find he had beaten her to the window seat by perhaps 10 minutes. He was already settled, Virgil open, one leg stretched out, and he looked up when the door opened with the expression of someone who had not expected the door to open. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not offer to move. She did not ask him to. The choice was available to both of them, and they both elected against it without discussion. She took the armchair by the fire, which was warm, and had the mild disadvantage of facing the window seat directly. "Radcliffe again?" he asked. "I have finished, Radcliffe. This is Cowper." "Poetry." The word was neutral, neither approval nor disapproval, simply identification. "How you say that?" Charlotte said, "as though it requires a response." "It doesn't require one. I was noting it." "Everyone notes it the same way, as though choosing poetry over prose requires explanation." "Does it not?" "No more than choosing Virgil over someone easier." She glanced at his book. "You could read a translation." "I could." He looked at her with the expression that was not quite amusement, but then I would only know what someone else thought Virgil meant. Charlotte looked at him. "That," she said, "is a more interesting answer than I expected." "What did you expect?" "That you would defend Virgil on grounds of tradition or proper education. Those are also true," he said, "but they are not the reason." He returned to his page. She returned to hers. The fire was warm. For the first time in 4 days, something in the room was almost easy. When he rose to leave an hour later, he paused at the door. "Cowper," he said, "what would you recommend?" Charlotte looked up from her page. He was watching her with the directness that she had once, wrongly she was becoming increasingly sure, classified as calculation. It was something simpler and more disconcerting than that. "The 5th book," she said. "There is a passage about winter evenings about the right company making a storm irrelevant." "I will find it," he said. She kept her eyes on her page. "You won't regret it." The door closed. She sat for some time in the warm library, not reading, and thought about the word company. Gerald Foss arrived on the 5th evening in the way that absent people often do, carried in on the current of ordinary conversation, deposited without warning, difficult to remove. It was Anne Pemberton who introduced him, not by intent, but by the chain of association that governs dinner tables. She mentioned a mutual acquaintance. The mutual acquaintance connected, in the small geography of the ton, to a man named Holt, not the Major, a different Holt, who had been seen lately in company with Gerald Foss. Someone asked whether Foss was not the man who had made rather a point of pursuing Lady Charlotte some seasons back. The table continued. Soup was consumed. Charlotte continued eating hers. "Foss," said Mr. Crawley, turning the name over. "I knew him slightly, good-looking fellow, rather too aware of it." "He was attentive," Charlotte said, because the gap on her side of the conversation had reached the length at which silence becomes its own statement. "For a season. It came to nothing. He married eventually," Anne offered. "A Miss Barton or Horton, someone with money." "Last spring," Charlotte confirmed. "I believe they are well suited." "Good," said the Major, with an unexpectedness that made his end of the table laugh, and the conversation moved on. Charlotte set down her spoon. The soup was excellent. She had no appetite left for it. Across the table, at the middle distance of 8 people and their various conversations, Louisa was looking at her with an expression Charlotte identified as that of a woman who had made a decision and was quietly monitoring its effects. Charlotte did not look toward the far end of the table, where William had been sitting in his usual quality of attentive silence, but she was aware that he had not spoken since the moment Foss's name had entered the room. After dinner, she went directly to the library. It was late, past 10, and the house was settling into its nightly arrangement of distant sounds and closed doors. She wanted the quiet of the window seat and the dark garden and the rain-washed glass, none of which required anything of her. She brought a candle from the hall table and sat in the dim room and did not open her book. The door opened 20 minutes later. William looked at her across the library with the expression of a man who had not planned to be here and had come anyway. He stood in the doorway for a moment, with his hand still on the handle, then let go of it and stepped inside and closed the door. He did not sit. He moved to the shelves on the near wall and stood with his back partially to her, looking at the spines without reading them. "You did not enjoy dinner," he said. "I enjoyed the first half of it well enough." "The mention of Foss." "Yes." "He did you harm?" "Not a question." Charlotte looked at him. In the candlelight his profile was present in the way that was specific to him, entirely attending without management. "He was dishonest," she said, "about his own intentions and about other matters." He turned then. "What other matters?" The words were right there, 4 years old and still sharp. "He told me your courtship was a calculation, that you needed a useful connection and I was convenient, that you had said so to people who knew you." She could say it now, in this room, with just the candle and the rain quiet. She did not. "It is past," she said. "I manage it well enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, with the sound of a man setting something heavy down with care. "I have no doubt you do." He crossed to the far shelves, his usual shelves, and selected a volume. She saw what it was before he turned. Cowper, slim, worn at the spine. He had found it already. "Good night, Lady Charlotte," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." He left. Charlotte sat in the window seat with the candle burning low and held the single fact that he had been reading Cowper and what it meant, and then made herself stop examining what it meant and looked at the garden until the candle guttered out. The following morning was still raining but lighter. the kind of rain that was considering stopping. Charlotte went down to breakfast earlier than usual and found Louisa alone in the morning room with her coffee and her household accounts. "We should talk," Charlotte said, closing the door. Louisa set her pen down with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "The house party," Charlotte said, sitting. "His being here, was it deliberate?" "In what sense?" "In the sense that you knew when you wrote to me exactly who else would be in this house for a fortnight, and you chose not to mention it because you knew I would decline." Louisa was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because I am tired," Louisa said simply. "I have been tired of it for 4 years. I have watched my brother manage an absence, and I have watched you manage a distance, and I have watched two people who are—" She stopped, began again. "Charlotte, I know my brother. I have known him for 27 years, and I know the difference between a man who was in love and a man who was performing interest, and I know which of those he was that season, and it was not the performance." Charlotte looked at her hands. "He was devastated when you refused him," Louisa said. "He did not say so. He is not a man who says so, but I saw it, and I know what I saw." "I had reason," Charlotte said. "I believed I had very good reason." "What reason?" The question sat between them, direct and quiet. Charlotte had answered it in the abstract. Foss was dishonest, it is past. But here was Louisa, who knew them both, and the abstract was no longer sufficient. "Gerald Foss told me," Charlotte said, "that your brother's courtship was a calculation, that William needed, that there had been some difficulty, some matter requiring a particular alliance, and that I had been identified as a convenient solution to it. He said it was known, that it had been spoken of among certain people." She kept her voice level. "He was very precise. He said he told me because he considered himself a friend, and felt I deserved the full information." Louisa stared at her. The silence had the quality of something landing. "He told you," Louisa said slowly, "that William courted you for strategic repair." "Yes." "Charlotte." Louisa's voice had gone very quiet. "My brother is the Duke of Fernworth. His title is 300 years old. His estate is one of the 10 largest in England. His family connects to half the ancient peerage of the north." She looked at Charlotte steadily. What conceivable difficulty could he have had that required the assistance of an earl's daughter, however well regarded her family, to repair? "The connection runs entirely the other way. Marrying you would have conferred nothing on him that he did not already possess in greater measure." Charlotte held her gaze. "I know," she said. "I have known that for some time. The logic does not withstand examination. But I was 21, and he was not easy to read, and Foss was very convincing, and I was not certain enough of my own judgment to simply disbelieve a man who seemed to be sorry to say what he was saying." "He lied to you deliberately," Louisa said, "with specifics, with false precision, because he wanted William removed from the situation, and you were the instrument." She stopped herself. "And you believed him, and refused William, and William has been—" She stopped again. "William has been what?" Charlotte said. Louisa looked at her for a long moment. The morning room was quiet. The rain had thinned to almost nothing against the window. "I have kept something," Louisa said at last. "He asked me to burn them. I could not bring myself to do it." She rose and went to the small travelling desk in the corner, the one she took everywhere, Charlotte knew, the desk that had sat in her room at Hale since she was a girl. She opened the lower drawer and removed a packet of letters, 6 by Charlotte's count, tied with ribbon that had been blue once and was now the colour of a worn sky. She held them for a moment before setting them in Charlotte's hands. "These are letters he wrote to me," she said. "In the 4 years since you refused him, he wrote every few weeks. He asked, in the early ones, if I knew what he had done wrong. In the later ones, he stopped asking, but he did not stop writing." She looked at the packet. "I kept them because they seemed like something that should exist somewhere. I did not understand exactly why until this week." Charlotte held the packet. The letters had the slight softness of paper that has been kept carefully for a long time. "He will be furious," she said. "Yes," Louisa agreed, "briefly. And then he will not be, and that will matter more." She went to the door. At the threshold she paused. "Charlotte, I would not do this if I did not believe it mattered. I have not interfered in 4 years, which has required considerable restraint. I am asking you to read them." She left. Charlotte sat at the morning room table with the letters in her hands, and the last of the rain moved quietly across the window, and after a long moment, she untied the grey ribbon. She read them in the morning room and sat with them in her lap for some time after. She had prepared herself for something. She had not prepared for this. The first letter was dated 3 weeks after her refusal. There was nothing performative in it, no rhetorical reach, no construction for effect. It was the letter of a man who was asking a genuine question and did not know how to dress it otherwise. I have thought about it a great many times from a great many angles. I cannot find the moment at which I misread her. I am not asking you to take sides. I am asking whether I have been a fool, whether there was something visible to everyone except me, as such things sometimes are. I thought, but it doesn't answer the question to say what I thought. What I thought and what happened are clearly different things, and I would rather understand the difference than rehearse my version of it. Charlotte held the letter flat in her lap and looked at the window for a moment. She is not a woman who refuses without reason. I have always known that about her. It is one of the things. Whatever her reason was, it was real to her. I only wish I knew it. Not to argue with it, to understand it. I would have corrected the cause if I had known it existed to be corrected. She folded the first letter and opened the second. Are you asked if I was managing? I am managing. I have been managing with some efficiency. The north drainage, the Fernworth tenancies, the east wing roof, which has apparently been a problem for 3 years without my full attention. These things benefit from attention, and I have been giving them a great deal of it. You may take from this what you will. A pause in the pen. She could see where he had held it without writing. I saw Pemberton at the Marchioness's assembly, not Anne, the brother, and he mentioned having seen Lady Charlotte at a dinner in town. He said she looked well. I am glad she is well. Please do not respond to that. She put it down, picked it up again. The third letter was written from Fernworth 6 weeks later, and the tone had settled into something more resigned, the way pain settles when one has stopped expecting it to close quickly. I have decided that the most useful thing I can do is stop trying to understand it and simply accept that it happened. I have held this position now for approximately 4 days. It is harder to hold than it looks. A line below, added in a slightly different hand as though written later. I saw Foss at Almack's. He asked how I was recovering from my disappointment. It is the second time he has used that word to me. I do not know what to make of it, except that he seemed pleased with himself in a way I found both disproportionate and unpleasant. Charlotte read the line twice, Foss asking after William's disappointment, with the ease of a man who knew precisely what he had engineered. She had been the instrument. It was that simple. Foss had wanted William removed, from Charlotte specifically or simply from the field, and he had found the mechanism and applied it at exactly the right moment, when she had been 21 and uncertain and not sufficiently armored. She opened the fourth letter. You asked what I would have said to her if she had permitted it. This is a question I have not allowed myself, because it leads nowhere useful. But since you ask, I would not have said much. I am not made for saying things, as you have observed with fraternal regularity since I was 12. I would have tried to make clear that I wanted nothing from her that she was not freely offering. Not her name, not her family's standing, not anything she came with. I wanted her, the specific woman, the one who argues at breakfast and reads in windows and will not perform opinions she does not hold. I had known within a fortnight of meeting her that there was not another one. I have not found evidence to revise that conclusion. A long pause in the pen. Burn this one? Burn them all, I think. I don't know why I keep writing them. Charlotte pressed her fingers against her eyes. She was 25 years old, and sitting in her best friend's morning room reading a man's private letters to his sister, and she was absolutely not going to come apart over them. She opened the fifth. I have been to Fernworth for a month, and I find I have not thought of her once. It began, and she saw through it at once, and apparently so had Louisa. There was a small mark in the margin, the nail mark of someone registering a sentence that required return, beside the next line, which is to say I have thought of her daily and have been occupied enough to keep it in its place. Which is a different thing entirely, and I will not have you tell me it isn't. She set the page down. The house is good. Fernworth is always good. It requires the whole of one's attention and does not leave room for things one has no use for. I am grateful for it. I am a duke, which is occupation enough, and I am not inclined to self-pity, and I will ask you again to stop inquiring. with what you apparently consider subtlety, after Lady Charlotte's present circumstances. I know she is well. I know she is in Wiltshire. That is sufficient. It is going to have to be. The 6th letter was written this past spring. She could see it in the date, and she could feel it in the letter itself. It had a different quality from the others, more finished, the way a thing is different when one has stopped expecting it to change. You will have heard that Cavendish has asked about Lady Charlotte. I have been told this by 3 separate people, which suggests either that the world is very small or that people believed I would have a reaction worth observing. I had no reaction worth observing. I hope she is happy if it comes to that. I hope whatever man she chooses is someone who understands what he has. Most men do not understand what they have until they have failed to keep it, at which point the understanding is accurate but too late. A pause. Then, in a slightly different pressure of pen, I am going to Louisa's house party in October. She has been asking me to visit since she married, and I have declined each time, and this year I find I have no sufficient reason to decline. That does not amount to cowardice, which is not a reason I am willing to give. Whatever she is planning, and she is planning something, I am not unacquainted with my sister, I am capable of managing it with dignity. A final line, set apart from the rest. Do not respond to any of this. I mean it this time. Charlotte folded the 6th letter. She sat for a long time at the morning room table with all 6 in her lap, the grey ribbon beside her, and looked at the window. He had not been calculating. There had been no strategic courtship, no difficulty to repair, no managed impression. Foss had been precise and sorrowful and convincing, because he had invented every word of it, and she had been 21 and insufficiently certain, and she had handed him exactly what he wanted, and given William Hale 4 years of letters he asked to have burned. I had known within a fortnight of meeting her that there was not another one. She stood up. She put the letters on the writing desk with care, aligned them, retied the grey ribbon. She smoothed her dress. She looked in the small mirror above the fireplace and found herself composed in the way that one is when something has shifted so entirely that composure is no longer an effort, but simply what remains. She went to find Louisa. She found her in the conservatory, which Louisa used as a refuge when she had done something she was waiting to be held accountable for. She was tending to a collection of potted dahlias with the industriousness of a woman keeping her hands busy. I read them, Charlotte said, closing the conservatory door. Louisa set down her trowel. All of them? All 6. Louisa exhaled slowly. And you were right. You have been right for 4 years and I have been wrong, and Foss was a deliberate liar, and your brother has been carrying a question without an answer because I put him there. She sat on the iron bench. I am going to speak to him. Not tonight, I need a night, but tomorrow. Yes, Louisa said. He will have opinions about your keeping the letters. He will be furious for approximately 10 minutes, Louisa said, sitting beside her, and then he will not be. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The 6th letter, she said. He knew you were planning something. He suspected. He came anyway. Because he couldn't find a reason not to that wasn't cowardice. She paused. That is very like him. Yes, said Louisa. It is. She looked at Charlotte with the steady warmth of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has decided the patience is finished. What do you want, Charlotte? Not for his sake, for yours. Charlotte looked at the dahlias holding their colour against the season and thought about a library and 6 letters and the word constantly, and 4 years of careful distance built on a lie. I want, she said, to correct the error, all of it. Louisa nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose long patience has been entirely vindicated. She picked up her trowel. Outside the conservatory, the last of the rain was easing, and the wet garden was beginning to catch the first silver brightness of a day, deciding to improve. That evening brought the first real break in the weather. The sky above Denmore cleared from the west in the late afternoon, and by 6 o'clock, the world outside was washed and entirely still, a deep blue evening replacing the flat grey of 5 days. The party, released from the drawing room, gathered on the terrace before dinner with the energy of people who have been indoors too long and are slightly giddy with the air. Charlotte came out with her shawl and stood at the terrace's edge and breathed the cold which smelled of wet stone and bare earth, and the copper beaches releasing the last of their water. The sky clears from the west first, said William from 2 feet to her left. She had not heard him come, she did not show it. Does it? In Derbyshire. The hills catch it from the other direction. He was looking at the horizon where the blue was deepest. It will hold tomorrow. 10 feet along the terrace, the rest of the party was fully absorbed in its own conversation. Mr. Crawley's voice, the Major's laugh, Anne Pemberton saying something dry to Mrs. Dean, private enough for a few minutes if one was careful. "You know this county," she said. "I have been coming here since Louisa married. Before that, Crawley and I were at school together." A pause. "He is the sort of friend one does not need to perform for. I find I have few of those." She looked at him. "You are surprisingly candid." "Occasionally," he said, with a precision that was almost humor, "in specific circumstances." "What circumstances?" He considered the question with his usual care. When the alternative is saying something less true in order to avoid saying something uncomfortable. He looked at her. "I find the less true version never serves anyone well in the end." Charlotte held that. "William," she said. "Lady Charlotte." He said it differently from the formal usage. The title was there, but it was not distance, it was something else, something that used her name within it. "I would like to speak to you properly, not here." She gestured toward the assembled party. "Tomorrow, the library, before the others are down." He looked at her for a long moment. The blue was deepening around them. The house threw warm light out across the terrace stones behind them. 7:30, he said. "Yes." He nodded once and simply, and they went in to dinner. Charlotte lay in the dark that night and looked at the ceiling. Through the window she could see stars, a full spread of them, the kind that appear only after days of cloud, making up for absence. She had the packet of letters on the night table beside her. She had not meant to bring them upstairs. She had brought them anyway. Tomorrow she would go to the library. She would tell him the truth of it, all of it, including the parts that did not reflect well on her. She would tell him about Foss and the specific lie, and the 4 years of distance built on it. She would do this with the composure of who she was, an earl's daughter and a woman of 25 who had made an error and was entirely capable of saying so. She was not certain precisely what would happen after. She was certain that whatever had been careful in her for 4 years was finished with being careful. She looked at the stars until she was sure of this, and then she closed her eyes and Derbyshire was very still around the house, and she slept. Charlotte arrived at the library at 7:30. She had dressed with the care of someone who was not going to acknowledge they were dressing with care. A morning gown of deep blue wool, her hair simply arranged, no jewelry, except the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. She had the letters in her hand. She had decided sometime in the early hours that she would bring them. Arriving without them would be its own kind of dishonesty. The library was empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the cold fire and the grey morning light coming through the south windows, and felt, briefly, the particular foolishness of someone who has prepared for a scene that has not yet materialized. She went in. She rang the bell, and when the housemaid appeared gave quiet instructions about the fire, and then sat in the window seat with the packet of letters in her lap, and her hands folded over them, and waited. The fire was lit, and the maid gone before he arrived. He arrived at 20 minutes to 8. He saw the letters first. His eyes went to the packet on her lap, the grey ribbon, the worn paper, before they went to her face, and she watched his expression do something careful and controlled, and not entirely successful. "She gave them to you," he said. "Yes." "When?" "Yesterday morning." "And you read them?" "All 6, Charlotte said. "I am sorry, I know you asked her to burn them." He moved to the fireplace. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Not a dramatic pause, simply a man giving himself the time to decide what his face would do. When he turned, it was composed. "What did you want to speak to me about?" he said. "Sit down, William." A pause. He sat, not the armchair by the fire, not the farthest available point from her. The chair beside the window seat, close. Charlotte looked at him steadily and said, "Gerald Foss told me your courtship was a calculation, that you had some difficulty to address, a matter of alliance, and that I had been identified as a useful instrument for addressing it. He said you had spoken of it, that it was known among people who knew you." She kept her voice level. "He said he was telling me because he considered himself my friend, and felt I deserved to know before I made a decision." William was very still. "He was precise about it," Charlotte said. "He was sorry to tell me. He was convincing, and I was 21, and I did not have enough certainty in my own judgment to simply disbelieve a man who appeared to be reluctant to say what he was saying." She paused. And you were not easy to read. That is not an excuse. I should have asked you. I should have told you what he had said and given you the opportunity to answer it. Instead, I refused you and said nothing about why. And you have been carrying a question without an answer for 4 years. I am sorry. Genuinely and completely sorry. The fire was still new in the grate. The morning light was strengthening outside. He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man processing something that has rearranged the shape of 4 years. A useful instrument, he said at last. Yes. For you believed that the Duke of Fernworth, with a title 3 centuries old and an estate the size of a small county, required a connection to repair some unspecified difficulty. When he said it, I thought the logic— Charlotte, his voice was not unkind, the logic had no foundation. I know that now. I knew it eventually, some time before this week. I had already begun to wonder if I had made an error. But I believed it at 21 because I was presented with specifics at a moment when I was not certain enough of your intentions to weigh them against a convincing lie. She held his gaze. I am not asking you to excuse it. I am simply telling you what happened. He was looking at her with an expression she could not simplify. It was not anger, or it had passed through anger briefly and come out into something more open and more complicated. Foss, he said. Yes. He asked me twice how I was recovering from my disappointment. You wrote about it. I read it, Charlotte said. He asked you with the ease of a man who knew what he had done. William stood, not dramatically, simply the movement of a man who needed to be on his feet. He went to the window and stood looking at the garden, which in the thin morning light was silver wet and entirely still. His hand found the window frame and rested there. I thought you simply did not want me, he said, not loudly. That is what I believed for 4 years, that you had looked at the situation clearly and made your decision, and that it was your right to make it, and that I had been wrong about what existed between us. You were not wrong, Charlotte said. He turned. You were not wrong about what was between us, she said. I knew it then. I refused you because of a lie, not because of how I felt. She held his gaze without flinching. How I felt was considerably more than I had managed to account for, and losing it, even on a false premise, was harder than I allowed myself to admit for a very long time. He was looking at her with the full and undistributed attention that was specific to him, and she felt it as a particular pressure. Not unpleasant, not anything like unpleasant, the pressure of being entirely seen by someone who has been looking for a long time. The letters, he said, you read them. Every word. Then you know— That you wanted me, Charlotte said. Specifically the particular woman, not what I came with. Not my family's standing or my father's reputation. Me. She paused. Yes, I know. The fire settled into a steady hum. Outside the window the garden was brightening. He was still looking at her, and she was looking at him, and the room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid, and she thought, you can be careful or you can be finished with care. She stood up. I have been wrong about you for 4 years, she said. I have been wrong and careful, and at a considerable and entirely unnecessary distance. I find I have very little interest in continuing any of those things. She took 1 step toward him. The question is whether what you wrote is still, whether you still— It is still, he said. 2 words plainly spoken. She felt them go all the way down. Then I would like to begin again, she said. All of it properly with Edward's knowledge, with time given to it. And then— She stopped, looked at him directly. I am asking whether you will have me. In the end. Whether you still want— He crossed the room in 3 steps, and she had just enough time to think, of course he does, you read the letters, before his hands were at her face. Careful, very careful, as though she was something he had not expected to be allowed to touch. And then he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting long enough that tentativeness was no longer the right instrument. She kissed him back with all 4 years of misdirected composure behind it, and felt something she had been holding, very carefully and for a very long time, go completely. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. His hands were still at her face. She could feel him breathing, steadier than she was, but only just. Charlotte, he said. I know, she said. Outside, the first clear morning in 6 days was fully arrived. The garden was brilliant with it. The copper beeches on the drive were lit from below, and the rest of the house was beginning to wake. She could hear the distant domestic sounds of the corridor, the kitchen, and none of it touched the particular stillness of the library. "I will write to Edward," he said. "You will receive a favorable reply. You sound very certain." "I am his favorite sister." "Are you his only sister?" "That," Charlotte said, "is entirely beside the point." The corner of his mouth moved, fully this time, a real smile, private and unhurried, the kind she thought very few people had seen. She stored it with the deliberateness of someone acquiring something they intend to keep. "You should go," he said, "before the house comes downstairs." "Yes." She did not move immediately. Then she stepped back, looked at him once more with the fullness of what had just shifted between them, and picked up the packet of letters from where she had set them on the window seat cushion. She held them for a moment, then she set them back down. "Keep them," she said. "Charlotte." "They are yours. They were always yours." She looked at him. "I am glad Louisa did not burn them." He looked at the letters and then at her. "So am I," he said. "God help me, so am I." She went to the door. At the threshold she paused, because he had paused at the threshold on 3 separate occasions in this house, and it was her turn. "The 5th book," she said. "The passage about winter. The right company making a storm irrelevant." "I found it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "I could tell from the beginning." She left. The corridor was empty and cool, and the morning light was coming in long through the east windows, and Charlotte Vane walked through it with the specific lightness of a woman who has set down something she has been carrying for too long and will not be picking it up again. She found Louisa in the breakfast room 20 minutes later, alone with her coffee and the household menus she reviewed every morning. Louisa looked at her once, a single complete assessment, and said nothing. She simply waited. Charlotte sat down and accepted her tea from the footman. "Well," said Louisa when the footman had gone. "Well," said Charlotte. Louisa's expression did the small, private, thoroughly satisfied thing Charlotte had been expecting. Too full for gloating, too warm for restraint. She looked like a woman who has waited 4 years for an obvious thing to happen and has arrived at the far end of the wait intact. "He will write to Edward," Charlotte said, "before the party ends." Louisa set down her cup with great deliberateness. "And Edward will—" "Say yes. He will say yes immediately and then spend a paragraph pretending he considered it, and then he will invite William to Vane Court and attempt to discuss drainage, because that is what Edward does when he approves of something and doesn't know how to say so directly." "He gets that from your father," Louisa said, and her voice had gone warm and slightly unsteady at the same moment. She looked at Charlotte across the table. "Charlotte, I am— If you say you told me so, I will rescind my permission to be pleased about this." "I was going to say I am very glad." Louisa smiled, the real one unguarded. "I have been very glad in anticipation for approximately 4 years, which has been its own kind of wearing, and I find the actual thing considerably better." Charlotte drank her tea. The breakfast room was filling now. She could hear the others on the stairs. Outside the window, the Derbyshire morning was proceeding with the beauty of a day that has been earned. The drive gleaming, the copper beaches brilliant, a sky that had committed entirely to being blue. William came down to breakfast 9 minutes later. He took his usual seat, accepted coffee, spoke with Major Holt about the cleared weather and the possibility of the walk to the North Hill that had been promised since day one. He did not look at Charlotte for the first 4 minutes. When he did, it was brief and entirely direct, and it was not the look of a man managing an impression. It was the look of a man who has something settled in him that was not settled before. Charlotte looked back 1 full second. She returned to her toast. Beside her, Anne Pemberton said, with the tone of someone who had been paying closer attention than anyone had given her credit for, "You look remarkably well this morning, Lady Charlotte." "The weather has improved," Charlotte said. Said Anne in the tone of someone who found this answer both accurate and entirely insufficient. The engagement was announced to Louisa and Mr. Crawley that same evening, in the south drawing-room, after the rest of the party had dispersed to the billiard-room and the upstairs sitting-room and the various occupations of a house at peace with itself. Louisa received the news with the composure of a woman who had expected exactly this outcome, which is to say, she received it with no composure whatsoever. She embraced Charlotte with both arms and held on for considerably longer than the occasion technically required. She then turned to her brother with the expression of a woman who has held a great deal in reserve for a very long time. "I told you," she said. "You told me nothing," William said. "You invited me to a house party." I told you in the 6th letter not to decline again. I arranged the library, I arranged the seating, I arranged... How you arranged an unconscionable number of things without informing anyone, which is a different matter entirely. William. Louisa stepped forward and took his hands. She looked at him, not with the look of a sister scoring a point, but with the direct, uncomplicated love of someone who has watched her brother be alone and careful for 4 years and has done what she could about it and is now at the other end. Are you happy? The word applied to him required a moment. Yes, he said, considerably. She looked at Charlotte. And you? Charlotte looked at William, who was looking at her with the expression she was learning. The one that was not cold, had perhaps never been cold, that she had years of misreading to account for and intended to spend considerably longer correcting. Yes, she said, very much. Mr. Crawley, who had been standing by the fire throughout this, with the expression of a man who is very pleased to be part of something and knows it, shook William's hand with vigorous feeling and then said, "Game pie tomorrow, to mark the occasion." To mark the occasion, Charlotte agreed. Louisa made a sound that was half laugh, half something older and warmer that had been building for years, and the fire crackled, and outside the October night pressed its stars against the windows of Denmore Park, and that was that. They had 9 days left at Denmore, and Charlotte had expected them to feel different, significant, somehow altered in texture. What surprised her was not the difference, but the ease of it. The grand, altered feeling she had braced for did not arrive. What arrived instead was simpler, the particular relief of being in a room with a person and not managing a single thing. They walked on the morning after the engagement, the whole party together for once, the long-promised walk to the North Hill and the Folly and the wide view over the valley. The paths were muddy and the air was sharp, and everyone was in better spirits than 6 days of rain had allowed. Charlotte walked with William at the back of the group, not because they had arranged it, but because that was simply where they were when the group set off, and neither of them moved to change it. The distance between them was 5 inches, not 3 feet, not the careful, measured space of people who have been keeping track. 5 inches, which was the ordinary distance of 2 people who had stopped needing to measure. He spoke about Fernworth because she had asked. A genuine question, not a conversational move. He answered in the way he answered things he actually wished to talk about, with detail and without performance. The beaches go last, he said. Everything else is turned by October, but the beaches hold on. By November they are the only colour left, and they burn for 2 weeks before they let go. That sounds worth seeing. He glanced at her. I have watched it every year since I was 12, and I find I do not tire of it. Most things one loves genuinely don't tire, Charlotte said. It is the things one performs love for that go thin. He was quiet for a moment. What do you love? He asked. Not socially, the real question. The one people do not ask at dinner parties because the answer might require something of them. Charlotte thought honestly. Reading, she said. Genuinely and without reservation. My brother Edward, though he is frequently exasperating. Wiltshire in February, which everyone considers the worst month for it, and they are wrong. Breakfast before anyone is yet performing for the day. She paused. And I find I love a library in the rain considerably more than I had previously accounted for. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I find I love a library in the rain considerably more than I expected to this fortnight. She looked at him. You could not have known, she said, when you arrived, that the library would... No, he said, but I find that is often the way of it. One arrives expecting one thing and the room turns out to contain something one was not prepared for. Charlotte held his gaze for a moment. The hill was steep, and the rest of the party was pulling ahead, and the sky above them was the definitive blue of a Derbyshire morning after a week of rain, and she thought, You have been waiting a long time, and so has he, and the room was right there all along. William, she said. Charlotte. When you come to Vane Court to speak to Edward, come in November. When the Fernworth beaches have gone, I want you to see ours. He looked at her with the full attention. They are remarkable. They are the best in Wiltshire. My father planted them the year he married my mother. They're 60 years old and they go entirely gold in the 3rd week of November, and they last for 10 days. I will come in November, he said, simply and completely, as though there were nothing else to say on the matter because there was not. The path levelled. Ahead, the party had reached the Folly and were exclaiming at the view, the valley below, Denmore in the middle distance, the stone of it warm against the dark of the surrounding trees. The smoke from its chimneys went straight up in the still air. "It is a very good view," Charlotte said. "It is," William agreed. He was not looking at the view. On the penultimate evening of the house party, after dinner and after cards and after Sir Edmund had made his early retirement and the Deans their slightly later one, the remainder of the party sat around the drawing-room fire with the ease of people who have spent a fortnight together and arrived, without meaning to, at genuine comfort. Major Holt was telling a story about Brussels that improved with each telling. Anne Pemberton was listening with the expression of someone who had noticed she was being charmed and had decided she did not particularly mind. Clara Pemberton had a novel. Mr. Crawley was simply happy, as he always was when his house was full. Charlotte sat in the corner of the sofa near the fire. William sat beside her, not performing proximity, simply there, in the easy way that things settle when they are permitted to. At some point, Anne caught Charlotte's eye across the room, and her expression did the quick, dry thing that Charlotte had liked from the first day. "Well?" Anne said quietly beneath the Major's story. "Well," Charlotte agreed equally quietly. "I thought when you arrived," Anne said, "that you both had the look of people who had been very careful for a very long time." "We had." "And now?" Charlotte looked at William, who was attending to the Major's story with his usual quality of complete and unperformed interest, his profile in the firelight warm and, she could only think the word, familiar, as though she had been sitting beside him like this for years and had simply needed reminding. "And now," Charlotte said, "we are being considerably less careful." Anne made a small sound of satisfaction. "It suits you both," she said, "the lack of care." Charlotte thought, "Yes, I find it does." The letter to Edward was written in the south drawing-room on the last full day at Denmore. At the writing desk by the window, William with his pen and Charlotte 3 feet away with her cowper, maintaining the pretense of reading and not offering suggestions. She offered 2 suggestions. The first was, "You do not need to enumerate your holdings in the second paragraph. Edward knows who you are." William looked up from the page. "I am being thorough." "You are being nervous." A pause, during which he appeared to consider and then declined to contest this. He crossed out the second paragraph and rewrote it in 4 lines. The second suggestion came at the close. "Sign it, William, not Fernworth. He's going to be your brother. Begin as you mean to go on." He looked at the letter. He crossed out Fernworth and wrote William in its place. He folded it, sealed it, and handed it to the footman without further comment, though the set of his mouth suggested the small concession had cost him something. Charlotte returned to her cowper. "It is a better letter for it." "You are very decided in your opinions." "I have always been decided in my opinions. You knew this before you asked me to marry you." "I knew it," he said, "before I knew much else about you." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she was still learning, the one that lived beneath the public face, that was not cold and had perhaps never been cold, and that she had 4 years of misreading to make amends for. "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "No," he said. "It is the opposite of a complaint." She returned to her page. The south drawing-room held them in its afternoon quiet, the fire warm, the October light coming in pale and level through the garden windows, and Charlotte thought, "This is what it will be. This ordinary, complete thing." She found she wanted it more than she had words for. Edward's reply came to Vane Court on the second day after the party ended, that he had no objections whatsoever, that he had in fact expected this development since approximately the spring of 1811, when he had watched William Hale watch his sister cross a room at the Athertons and had drawn his own conclusions, and was surprised it had taken as long as it had, that William was welcome at Vane Court at his earliest convenience, and that Charlotte should not read anything into the brevity of the reply as it was simply his way. It was 4 lines. Edward was not a man of extensive correspondence, which Charlotte had always considered both a fault and a mercy, the letter said in its entirety, as she well knew. Charlotte read it twice and laughed, the real one, not the drawing-room version. She showed it to William, who had ridden over from the inn at the village where he was staying until the formalities were concluded. He read it. "Since 1811, he said. Edward has always been perceptive. He keeps it quiet. He expected it in 1811 and said nothing to you for 4 years. He knew I would not have listened," Charlotte said. "He is perceptive about that as well." William looked at the letter for a moment longer, then folded it and gave it back to her, and his expression was the one she was accumulating, private and warm, and belonging to no room but the one they were in together. November, he said. Third week, she said. Come for the beaches. I will come, he said, for considerably more than the beaches. I know, she said, but they are a very good excuse. He came on the 16th of November. The beaches were exactly as she had described, the long avenue of them from the gatehouse burning gold in the thin autumn light, 60 years of growth doing what 60 years of growth can do when it has been planted with intention. Charlotte watched his carriage come up the drive from the east window of the morning room and felt something she decided simply to allow. Edward received him in the hall with the vigorous handshake of a man who was genuinely glad of an occasion and did not quite know how to say so. Charlotte came downstairs in her own time and found them in the library, Vane Court's library, smaller than Fernworth's and dearer to her for it, discussing the drainage situation in the North Field, on which subject William apparently had views that Edward found immediately useful. William rose when she came in. The beaches, Charlotte said, are at their absolute best today. I saw them from the drive, he said. Then you know I was not exaggerating. I never thought you were exaggerating, he said. I simply wanted to see them myself. Edward looked between them with the expression of a man who has understood the room completely and has decided the room does not require him in it. I'll leave you to the garden, he said, with a vagueness that fooled nobody. Walk. The north path is good after the rain. He left with the slightly overdone casualness of a 28-year-old earl who was, Charlotte thought, rather better at this than he pretended. They walked the long avenue in the November light, the fallen leaves gold underfoot and still holding on the branches above, the sky pale and cold and entirely still. Charlotte wore her warmest cloak. William walked beside her with his hands clasped behind his back, which was how he walked when he was thinking about something. They are remarkable, he said. I told you. You did. He looked at the trees with genuine feeling, the feeling of a man who loves a landscape and is not embarrassed by it. Your father planted them the year he married. The spring after. He planted an oak for my mother's father the same year. The oak is in the East Meadow. It is considerably less dramatic, but he loved it more, I think, because my grandfather had died the winter before, and it was a way of keeping him. She paused. He was that kind of man. He kept things. William was quiet for a moment. What was he like? She thought about it honestly, the way she had not allowed herself to for some time. Good, she said. Genuinely good, which is rarer than it should be. He had strong principles and a low tolerance for pretension, and he loved my mother in the way that people love things they have chosen entirely freely. He died when I was 22. She paused. I managed the estate for 18 months before Edward was ready to take it. I don't regret it. I learned a great deal. I know, William said. Louisa told me. What did she say? That you ran it better than most men twice your age. That you spent the first month learning the tenants' names and the second month learning what they actually needed. He glanced at her. She said you were entirely composed about it, and that she believed you had cried exactly once in private and refused to discuss it with anyone. Once, Charlotte confirmed. In the church after the harvest festival. It seemed the right occasion for it. He nodded. They walked on beneath the gold. A leaf came down ahead of them, turning slowly, and landed without a sound on the wet path. I would like you to see Fernworth in winter, he said. Not spring when it is recovering, January when it is simply what it is. Why January? Because January is when I know best what I think of a place, he said. When there is nothing to be charmed by, only the thing itself. Then I will come in January, she said. We will be married by January. She looked at him. He was still looking at the avenue ahead, at the gold light coming through the branches. I have not yet proposed to you formally, he said. I am aware of this. I proposed in the library at Denmore in a fashion that covered the essential ground but lacked the form. It covered the essential ground admirably, Charlotte said. Nevertheless, he stopped walking. She stopped. He turned to face her, and the gold was all around them and the avenue was absolutely still, and he said, Lady Charlotte Vane, I have wanted to marry you since the autumn of 1810. I have not managed a single day in the 4 years since in which the wanting went away, which I have found instructive if inconvenient. I'm asking you, clearly, formally, in the sight of your father's beeches, whether you will marry me. She looked at him. I will, she said. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and they stood in the beech avenue in the November light, their breath misting, the gold above them and beneath them and in the pale cold air, and she felt it completely, The 4 years folded and put away, the lie finally broken. The particular man she had always known was particular, standing in front of her having said the truest thing he knew how to say. He kissed her hand. Then he kissed her in the middle of the avenue, with the November cold around them and the estate watching and not a care given for either. Above them, a single beech leaf turned gold all the way down. They were married on the 12th of January. Charlotte had expected to feel something ceremonial about the day, the weight of it, the public fact of becoming. What she felt instead, dressing in her room at Vane Court, in the thin winter light, while her maid arranged her hair, and Louisa sat in the window seat performing Serenity with moderate success, was simply readiness. The clean, specific readiness of someone who has arrived somewhere they were always meant to arrive, and is not surprised to find it true. The church was the one below Fernworth, which William had proposed and she had agreed to at once. It was a small, ancient thing. Norman nave, high clear windows, the smell of cold stone and old candles that centuries of ceremony had not displaced. The village had come, and the tenants and the county, because a duke's marriage was the county's occasion, whether the duke wished it or not. The pews were full. Louisa sat in the front with Mr. Crawley and cried with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had been building toward this moment for 4 years and intended to honor it properly. Charlotte walked up the aisle on Edward's arm. He was not quite steady, which she had not expected. He was young for it, 28 and the Earl, and still occasionally surprised by himself, and he held her arm with a care that said he understood exactly what he was doing. She covered his hand with hers briefly. He exhaled. William was at the altar. He was looking at her before she was halfway down the aisle, and he was not performing composure. He was simply there. Dark coat, the particular quality of stillness that was his and no one else's, with his attention directed at her and nowhere else. And she thought, I spent 4 years not knowing this is what he looked like when he looked at me. Not cold, not calculated. The face of a man looking at the specific person who knows it and has known it for a long time. She smiled. She could not help it. The corner of his mouth moved in return. Edward gave her hand to William. The ancient words were said, worn smooth with repetition, still exact. Charlotte said hers without faltering. William said his quietly, and with the same directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. With this ring I thee wed. He put it on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his grandmother's, which he had told her about in the beech avenue, and which she had said she would be glad of, because things worn with love for long enough carry it. She felt it settle on her hand, like something finding its place. To love and to cherish till death us do part. The church held still around them. Outside the clear windows, the January sky was the pale, precise blue of a cold morning, with no weather in it, and the whole of the rest of their lives was waiting without urgency, and Charlotte thought, yes, this is the shape of it. Fernworth in January was exactly what he had promised. She had known it abstractly, the scale of it, the age, the reputation. In the actual, she found it did not oppress. It was a house that had been lived in for 300 years, and it showed, not in grandeur, but in the specific wear of rooms that had been used by people who loved them. The floors of the main corridor were stone, softened by generations of passage. The library, the East Wing library, which she had heard of since Louisa's wedding, took up the entire wing and was lit by 6 tall windows that faced south and caught every hour of winter light there was. She stood in it on her second day, and slowly turned and felt something that was not ambition and was very nearly homecoming. Her sitting room was in the East Wing, adjacent to the library. It had a window seat. She had not asked for it. She had mentioned once in passing in the south drawing room at Denmore that she had always preferred east-facing rooms in the morning. The window seat had been there when she arrived, deep and well cushioned, the fabric a green she would have chosen herself. She did not remark on it. He did not remark on it. She sat in it on the first morning with her coffee and watched the Fernworth grounds in their winter state, bare trees, the south meadow silvered with frost, the sky doing what January skies do when they have decided to be clear, and felt very simply, and without needing to examine it further, that she was in the right place. The mornings became theirs quickly. He rose early and was in the library by the time she came down, reading or working through correspondence or attending to the estate matters that accumulated without regard for season. She brought her own work, letters, the household accounts she had asked to understand, the cowper that had migrated. now worn with the markings of a winter's deep study, and sat in the chair beside the fire, and the library held them both in the particular quiet that was not silence but rest. He talked to her about the estate, in the way he talked about things he actually wanted to discuss, with detail, without performance, assuming her interest because her interest was real, and he had noticed the Fernworth tenancies, the north drainage, which had been resolved in November by a method a tenant had proposed 3 years prior and no one had properly heard. The history of the East Wing Library, built by his great-great-grandfather, in a fit of bibliographic ambition so complete it had become the house's defining character. She asked questions, real ones. He answered with the care of someone who had not had many people want the detail and intended to do it justice. One morning at the breakfast table, she asked about his mother. He looked up from his letters. "She died when I was 16, he said. Louisa was 14. "I know, I am asking what she was like." He set his letter down. He considered, genuinely finding the accurate words rather than the convenient ones. "Exacting," he said at last. "In the best sense. She did not permit careless thinking. She had a precise idea of what a person owed the world. Not in the social sense, not propriety for its own sake, but in the sense of using one's mind honestly, one's resources justly, one's word exactly." A pause. "I think Louisa takes after her more than I do. Louisa has the warmth she had." "You inherited the precision," Charlotte said. "So I have been told." A slight dryness. "Usually by people who mean it rather less as a compliment." "I mean it entirely as one," Charlotte said. "I have always preferred precision to warmth that is not genuine." He looked at her. "She would have liked you," he said. "She had a particular respect for women who held their position without apology." "I am glad," Charlotte said. She meant it entirely. He picked up his letter again. She returned to her accounts. The fire crackled. The January morning pressed pale and clear at the windows, and the library held them, as it had always held them, in its easy particular quiet. There was an evening in late January, after a dinner at which they had been the only company, after the candles had burned low and the house had settled into its winter silence, when Charlotte was in the library window seat with Cowper in her lap, not reading, watching the frost build on the outside of the glass. William was at the desk, writing a letter or estate notes. She could hear the scratch of his pen. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was lit by the desk candle and the two on the mantelpiece and the grey-white light of a clear January night outside. She had been sitting quietly for perhaps 20 minutes when he looked up. "You are not reading," he said. "I am thinking." "About what?" She looked at the frost on the glass, which was making its quiet patterns in the cold. "About the narrowness of it," she said. "The path that led here. Foss keeping his lie to himself, and we never meet properly. You declining Louisa's invitation, and we never have those days at Denmore. The letters burned, and I never know what was in them." She paused. "It is a very narrow path, William." He set down his pen. He came to the window seat, slowly, without urgency, the way he moved through rooms that were his, and sat beside her. There was room for two if one was willing. They were. Their shoulders were together. The cold came off the glass in front of them, and the last warmth of the fire came from behind, and Charlotte was aware of both and of him, specifically beside her. "Yes," he said, "it was narrow." "Does it not alarm you, when you think about it?" He considered the question properly, the way he considered everything. "It did," he said, "before January. Now I find it is simply the shape of the thing, the path that happened to be this one." He looked at her, and in the pale frostlight, his eyes were warm and entirely present. "I cannot afford to fear the paths that were not taken. I have the one that was." She looked at him. "That is a more settled answer than I have managed." "You have been settled for less time," he said, without any judgment in it. 3 weeks of marriage has given you wisdom." 3 weeks of marriage," he said, "has given me considerably more than wisdom." He said it plainly, the way he said true things, without reach, without ornament, simply set down for her to take or leave. She took it. She turned toward him fully. "William." "Charlotte." "I am glad you came to the house party. I am glad Louisa did not burn the letters. I am glad Gerald Foss is entirely gone from this room, and from every room I will ever occupy, and I intend never to give him another moment of my attention." "He's entirely gone," William said. "There is only me." "There is only you," she said. "There very much is." He reached for her hand in the frost-lit room. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, unhurried, the gesture she had first felt on the terrace at Denmore that belonged to no one else in the world, and she let the last careful thing go. The final held breath of 4 years. She leaned into him in the January library, while the frost made its patterns on the cold glass and the house breathed around them in the dark. Outside, the Fernworth grounds were silver and still. The great beeches were bare now, their gold long surrendered, the branches reaching clean and dark against the night sky. They would hold like that until April. Then the green would come. Charlotte looked at the frost and thought, "This is what I was always looking for, in the libraries and the window seats and the rooms that asked nothing of me. Not the rooms, the person in them. The particular man who found her in window seats without meaning to, who read Cowper because she recommended it, who kept the letters she had asked him to burn and said true things plainly, and looked at her as though she were the specific person and had always been, and there were no other. She had been wrong about him for 4 years. She was not wrong now. She would not be wrong again. The candles burned low and they did not move to replace them. The frost built its quiet architecture on the glass. William's hand was warm over hers, and Fernworth held them in its winter dark, and Charlotte Hale let her eyes close and felt, without qualification or reservation, entirely at rest. That was the whole of it. That was more than enough. That was everything.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.